September 11, 2001 shattered more than buildings. It shattered fiscal restraint. What followed was the most audacious financial experiment in human history. Two wars costing $2 trillion funded entirely through borrowing. A housing crisis that nearly collapsed the global economy. A pandemic that required printing money at unprecedented scales. Today, America owes more than $36 trillion to the world, which is equivalent to more than the combined economic output of China, Japan, and Germany. Yet somehow, the world continues to lend money to the US. Why? We've already learned how the US trapped the global economy with dollar dominance. Now we'll see the story of the US debt of $36 trillion, how it began, how the entire world funded US's military expansion, and how the entire debt reached this towering figure. Let's start. The story of US debt begins with an act of seeming generosity. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, promised $13 billion to war-torn Europe after the end of Second World War. Yet, this generosity had a hidden architecture of dependence behind it. This debt served a strategic purpose. Every dollar sent abroad eventually returned with the European dependence on American goods, American financial systems, and American technology. By 1950, the Korean War had started, which added $30 billion to the US debt. This was the last war that America would finance largely through taxation rather than debt. Under President Truman, the total debt stood at $250 billion, which seemed manageable, even prudent for a nation claiming to rebuild the whole world. But this was about to change as the Cold War was about to begin, which would immensely grow this mountain of debt. President John F. Kennedy inherited $290 billion in 1961. His vision of America demanded investment for space exploration, for social programs, and for military supremacy. The Soviet Union and the US were competing for moon landing to establish global superiority in terms of technology. And the US won this competition, but this came at a cost of $25 billion in 1961. Then came President Lyndon Johnson with his vision for the great American society. But he also inherited the Vietnam War. And these two combined created what economists refer to as the first modern fiscal expansion. Vietnam became America's financial abyss. Between 1964 and 1967, the US military spending doubled from $23 billion to $46 billion, and the total war's cost was around $111 billion, which is equivalent to $700 billion in today's terms. Johnson's government believed that they could afford both guns and butter, meaning military spending and social programs. But the future would prove this optimism very costly for the US. The Bretton Woods system of 1944 was still in force. So France, along with other countries, started demanding their gold back in exchange for the dollars that they had accumulated through global trade. This resulted in the downward fall of America's gold reserves, while their debt reached $400 billion. But then, President Nixon came up with a revolutionary solution where he changed the rules of the game entirely with the Nixon shock, where he ended gold convertibility to dollars, which meant that now dollars was not backed by anything other than the trust in the United States of America, a luxury that no other country exercises even till now. This was a turning point in history as it equipped USA with unlimited financial power. Then arrived President Ronald Reagan in 1981 with a debt of approximately $1 trillion by now and a radical theory. The debt could fuel growth rather than constrain it. The supply side economics promised tax cuts that would result in such robust economic expansion that the revenues would actually increase. President Reagan's policies created a fascinating paradox. While cutting taxes dramatically, he simultaneously embarked upon the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. This was the time where the most number of nuclear warheads existed on Earth, with the Soviet Union having 33,000 nuclear warheads and the US having around 32,000 nuclear warheads. The Strategic Defense Initiative alone cost hundreds of billions of dollars. The US public debt nearly tripled from $712 billion to $2.0542 trillion in a span of 8 years. President Reagan's revolution succeeded in ending stagflation and promoting entrepreneurship, but at a cost: the national debt, once seen as a temporary burden of wartime, became a permanent feature of American governance. Yet this strategy achieved something unprecedented. It bankrupted the Soviet Union. The Kremlin, attempting to match America's military spending, discovered that their centralized economy could not sustain such expenditure. President Reagan had weaponized debt itself, using America's superior borrowing capacity to win the Cold War without firing a single shot. Then comes President Bill Clinton in 1993 with a debt of $4 trillion. But with the combination of tax increase, spending restraint, and the unexpected windfall of technology boom, his administration achieved something remarkable: actual budget surpluses by the late 1990s. For a brief moment, it appeared that America might actually pay down its debt. The Congressional Budget Office projected that the entire national debt could be eliminated by 2010. These projections assumed, of course, that nothing would disturb the peaceful prosperity of the late 20th century. September 11th, 2001 shattered more than buildings. It shattered fiscal restraint. President George W. Bush inherited a debt of $5.7 trillion and a nation that demanded both security and vengeance. President Bush launches war on terror while simultaneously cutting taxes. Two wars, Afghanistan and Iraq, combined with tax cuts and Medicare expansion, pushed debt from $5.7 trillion in 2001 to over $10 trillion by 2008, funded entirely through borrowing. Simultaneously, President Bush's domestic policies encouraged home ownership through expanded lending programs. Then comes the year 2008, where greed meets gravity. When the housing bubble inevitably burst, the government faced two choices: economic collapse or unprecedented intervention. The response is swift and expensive. $700 billion for troubled asset relief programs and hundreds of billions more in Federal Reserve interventions. The federal government spending commitments explode by over 25% in 2008 alone, adding over $1 trillion in obligations even before the astronomical bailout costs are counted. By 2009, the debt had reached $11.9 trillion. America had discovered that its financial dominance granted it a unique privilege: the ability to borrow its way out of any crisis, no matter how severe. President Barack Obama inherited the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression and a debt approaching $13 trillion. His response embodied classic Keynesian economics. When private demand collapses, the government must step into the breach. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act injected $831 billion into the economy through infrastructure spending, tax cuts, and state aid. Obama's defenders argued that deficit spending prevented a second Great Depression, while the critics contended that such massive borrowing merely prevented an inevitable reckoning. Both perspectives contained elements of truth. By 2017, the debt had reached $19.9 trillion as the Federal Reserve kept the interest rates near zero, making borrowing appear almost costless. Donald Trump campaigned on reducing debt while simultaneously promising massive tax cuts and increased infrastructure investment. His Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 reduced corporate tax rates from 35% to 21%, adding an estimated $1.9 trillion over 10 years, pushing the total debt to $23 trillion by 2019. The COVID-19 pandemic provided the ultimate test of America's borrowing capacity. The CARES Act alone authorized $2.2 trillion in spending. Subsequent relief packages pushed total COVID spending beyond $6 trillion, vaulting debt past $26 trillion, then $30 trillion, and then beyond. President Joe Biden inherited a debt of $28.4 trillion and an economy scarred by the pandemic. His Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act committed $1.2 trillion to roads, bridges, broadband, and clean energy. The Inflation Reduction Act added hundreds of billions more in climate and healthcare spending. By July 2024, a turning point arrives for the first time in American history. The interest payments on national debt, $870 billion, exceeds the spending on national defense. By March 2025, debt rises to $36.5 trillion and still climbing. Interest payments now consume 3% of the GDP and are projected to reach $1 trillion annually by 2026. This total debt represents roughly 120% of the USA's economic output. To put this in perspective, even if every American contributes $10,000 tomorrow, it would barely make a dent in the total national debt. This mountain of debt, built over 8 decades, casts a shadow over every American fiscal policy. But here lies the most remarkable aspect of the story. $36 trillion of debt, by all conventional wisdom, should represent national bankruptcy. But it actually represents the world's most sought-after investment. So how did the US convince the entire world to eagerly purchase its debt and fund its military expansion? The genius of American debt strategy was not just in accumulating obligations, but in convincing the world to willingly finance their debt. This required a sales pitch of unprecedented sophistication, targeting the deepest needs and fears of the foreign governments. America's first argument was existential: security. To allies in Europe, Asia, and beyond, American debt instruments represented more than just financial investments. They were insurance policies against any kind of geopolitical chaos. Countries purchasing US Treasury bonds were essentially buying protection under America's nuclear umbrella. South Korea, for example, stationed mere miles from a hostile neighbor, North Korea, found American bonds irresistible when coupled with American military guarantees. Japan, having experienced the devastating power of American military technology, chose partnership over confrontation. European nations, surrounded by the Soviet threats, saw US Treasury securities as tangible proof of American commitment to their own defense. Beyond security, America offered something equally valuable: access to technological innovation. countries holding substantial dollar reserves gained privileged access to American institutions, research facilities, and cutting-edge industries. China's massive accumulation of US Treasury bonds in the 90s and 2000s coincided with unprecedented technology transfer. Chinese students filled American universities, Chinese companies partnered with American firms, and Chinese manufacturers gained access to the American markets. The bonds served as entry tickets to the world's most advanced economy. American debt instruments offered something no other nation could match: perfect liquidity. Unlike bonds from some smaller nations, US Treasury securities could be sold at any hour in any quantity. The Bank of Japan, holding over $1 trillion in US securities, could liquidate portions instantly during market stress. The European Central Bank used treasury holdings as collateral for emergency lending. Even nations politically opposed to American policies found themselves dependent on treasury liquidity during financial crisis. The petrodollar system is America's most powerful debt selling tool. Every barrel of oil sold anywhere in the world must be purchased only in US dollars. Because of this, oil exporters across the world accumulate massive dollar surpluses. But what do they do with these green mountains of cash? They buy the US Treasury bonds, which is the safest place to park petrodollars. This creates a beautiful cycle for America. The world needs dollars to buy oil, so they sell goods to Americans to earn those dollars. Then they lend those dollars back to the US government through treasury bond purchases. And due to this vicious cycle, Japan holds over $1.1 trillion of US debt, China $859 billion of US debt, and the United Kingdom $710 billion. Major oil exporters like Saudi Arabia and UAE accumulated trillions of dollars through petroleum sales. Instead of converting these dollars into their local currencies immediately, which would destabilize exchange rates, they instead park these funds in US Treasury securities, earn interest while maintaining their own currency stability. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank become America's financial missionaries. Crisis-struck nations receive rescue packages denominated in dollars, which forces them to hold US dollar reserves. Countries needing emergency dollar funding need to hold US securities as collateral. So crisis response also becomes an avenue for expansion of foreign ownership of US debt. So US treasuries are more than bonds. They are diplomatic passports stamped with "In God We Trust." They represent membership to an exclusive club where the house always wins, because the house prints the chips. Yet, every system of dominance carries within it the seeds of its own transformation. As this web of financial dependence grows ever more complex, so too does the determination of nations to find another way. In boardrooms, from Beijing to Brussels, a quiet revolution is taking shape. Nations are finally questioning whether their prosperity must forever flow only through American financial channels. The first part to freedom is diversification. Central banks worldwide are reducing their dollar holdings from historical averages of 70% to below 60%. Gold purchases have surged. Central banks purchased 1,136 tons of gold in 2022, the highest ever since 1967. The message is clear: don't put all your eggs in America's basket. The second path runs through bilateral agreements that bypass dollar entirely. China has established currency swap lines worth over $500 billion with over a dozen countries. ASEAN nations are piloting a local currency settlement framework allowing trade in rupiah, ringgit, and baht instead of dollars. Russia and China conduct an increasing share of over $200 billion of their annual trade in rubles and yuan. Even India and Russia have created ruble-rupee trade mechanisms. Every transaction done outside the dollar system is a declaration of independence. Technology offers another pathway towards monetary independence. The Central Bank Digital Currencies Initiative allows nations to conduct international trade without any dollar intermediation. China's digital yuan, the European Union's digital euro project, India's international UPI, and similar other initiatives across dozens of other nations represent attempts to bypass traditional dollar-based settlement systems. The M-Bridge project, connecting the central banks of China, Thailand, Hong Kong, and the UAE, has already processed over $12 billion of cross-border transactions using distributed ledger technology. Russia's SPFS system and China's CIPS network offer swift alternatives to countries seeking financial sovereignty. Several nations have started exploring commodity-backed trading arrangements. Russia and China have conducted oil transactions in rubles and yuan, and even India and Iran have arranged rupee-rial trade agreements. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange now trades oil futures in yuan. Russia accepts rubles for natural gas sales to unfriendly nations, and sanctioned nations like Iran and Venezuela are increasingly pricing their resources in either local currencies or gold. These individual efforts scattered across the globe point toward a larger truth. The question is no longer whether alternatives to dollar dominance will emerge, but can humanity come up with something better than what came before? Can we build a system that serves all nations equally, rather than privileging just one nation? The path forward requires not the destruction of American prosperity, but the construction of a world where no single nation's economic choices can hold others hostage. History suggests that genuine prosperity only occurs when economic power is distributed rather than concentrated. A polycurrency reserve system distributes power and risk. Instead of having one dominant currency, international reserves could include dollars, euros, pounds, rubles, yen, yuan, rupee, and even a basket currency backed by multiple economies and commodities. This will not eliminate national currencies, but it will limit any single nation's ability to weaponize finance. When no one country can impose financial sanctions or manipulate global liquidity, true economic sovereignty becomes possible. The institutions born at Bretton Woods must evolve or become irrelevant. Reform of voting shares at the IMF and the World Bank must reflect today's economic realities, not 1944's power structure, which would give voice to the global south and the emerging economies. Transparent governance means predictable rules that equally apply to all participants, not special privileges for those who write the rules. Modern technology makes such cooperations feasible in ways unimaginable during the Bretton Woods era. Distributed ledger systems, artificial intelligence, and quantum encrypted communications could create a global financial network which is not owned by any single nation. A truly free global economy requires fiscal responsibility from all nations, including the United States. When the debt to GDP ratios surpass sustainable levels, markets, not political considerations, must enforce discipline through higher borrowing costs. This isn't punishment, it's accountability. Nations that live within their means gain credibility and lower borrowing costs, and nations that don't face market consequences regardless of their military or economic power. Future generations deserve a global economy where prosperity flows from productivity and innovation and not from monetary manipulation, where financial crisis in one country does not take the global economy down with it. The story of American debt represents more than just accounting. It reveals how power adapts and evolves in the modern world. As we stand at the threshold of a new era in global finance, we face a choice between perpetuating systems of dependency or creating structures of genuine cooperation. The game continues, but perhaps it's time to rewrite the rules once more.